The origins of communism, depending on how broadly one defines it, stretch back as far as some of the religious and anti-monarchical political movements of the Middle Ages and post-Enlightenment Europe. But the modern ideologies of socialism and communism took form in the upper middle intellectual classes of industrialized 19th century Europe, most notably with Karl Marx, and in the aftermath of World War I, their implementation in the ashes of the Tsar's empire following the Russian Revolution of 1917. As Europe struggled to make sense of itself after the Great War, America was enjoying a relative boom during the Roaring Twenties and remained relatively resistant to calls for an atheistic workers' revolution in a still deeply religious and geographically dispersed society. During the Great Depression of the 1930s, however, the appeal of the communist promises of work, bread, and solidarity began to spread worldwide, and the seeds for communist infiltration into American society took hold, most notably in the Roosevelt Administration and right up through the Second World War as the United States allied itself with the Soviet Union.
Well, I'm not a crook. I've earned everything I've got.
The military-industrial complex.
A new world order.
But we are here to destroy the control over the industry of other people.
I did not trade arms for hostages.
It's been time,
На полный разгром гнусных захватчиков.
Myth20c podcast.
Welcome to the Myth of the 20th Century podcast. Today we're going to talk about the specter haunting the 20th century, and that specter is, of course, communism, the Red Menace. And I'm joined here, myself, Nick Mason, joined by Hank.
Hi.
Adam.
Hey.
And Hans.
Hi there.
Now, this is familiar territory to a lot of our listeners. However, it's not something that has been exhausted or really covered in full. And we're going to poke at the surface, and hopefully this will be the beginning of a in-depth series that we're going to be doing, exploring communism, its role in the 20th century, the complicity of Western elites, and the damage that it did. And so to start off with, let's give a few thoughts on communism, where it comes from, what kind of ideology is it, what's it paired up against, what are its contenders. And to start that, let's throw it to Hans. Hans, what is communism?
It's interesting you should say that. It's kind of unclear what communism is when you really think about it. Ostensibly, communism is the output of Marxist theory as dictated by Marx and Engels in the mid-19th century, along with a litany of other theorists who came thereafter to expound upon the general principles of Marxism. Typically, you want to distinguish between big C communism and little c communism. So little c communism is a very literal interpretation of what communism should be, which is a sort of anarcho, or in theory at the teleological endpoint, a sort of anarcho-communist society where there are no laws or no hierarchies. There's nothing really going on. There's no real culture. It's just individuals living side by side in an attempt to produce goods and services for no real reason for one another, sort of endlessly until the death of the planet. If you really think about it, this is sort of an emulation of what human society was probably like when humans first came onto the scene on the planet Earth. There's no real point to anything, and the only difference is that those people in early human societies would have had some sort of spirituality, some kind of religion, whereas Marxist anarcho-communism has no religion, has no spirit.
One of the immediate ironies of legitimate Marxism, actual prior to the first great revision that we'll get into, which is Leninism. Marxism, the endpoint that you describe really is not altogether that different than what a lot of liberals, extreme liberals, people like anarcho-capitalists would want.
It's identical.
It's literally identical. Yes.
So this is pretty early in the show to go full Moldberg. But we're going to be jumping into this again and again and again, I think. So this is as good of a point as any. There is a thesis that on a basic level, Marxism and more aptly communism per se than all the sort of intellectual baggage of Marxism has at least significant genealogical descent from a particular subspecies of Christianity, specifically ultra-Calvinism or quasi-Unitarianism, that believes in things like the universal brotherhood of man, the futility of violence or the desirability of pacifism, fair distribution of goods, and a sort of managed utopian society, which you can see attempts to create on a micro scale these sorts of things, even as far back as 1500s Germany.
I'm sorry, I'm going to stop you right there. Who created Marxism again?
Well, that'd be Karl Marx.
Right, and where's he from, and who is he?
He's, as they say, from Germany.
Who's his grandfather?
We need to distinguish that.
What did he
Karl
do?
Marx he's from Germany. He is not German. We should make that clear.
Well, who's to say who's German? I mean, look at the pictures today of the new Germans.
It's a social construct.
Oh, yes. There is no Germany, don't you know?
I don't have the biography here off the top of my head, but I believe at least
Karl Marx's grandfather was a Jewish rabbi.
Right, and there's who here is up on their various Jewish heresies.
Not
I should
me.
probably be more up on them, but which ones are you referring to?
This is the.
I can think of 6 million of them.
Yeah, this is the Rabbe on Twitter, REBBE, that Karl Marx's grandfather, the rabbi, had a specific affiliation with this Frankist school of Judaism, which is effectively like this Jewish heresy. It gets very involved, and I think that actually he substantially overstates the case. But it does have certain precursors in this sort of millenarianism. I can never pronounce that word. That the way that you achieve utopia is by sort of enacting the opposite of the Talmudic commandments, salvation through sin, all of these sort of delightful heresies, essentially.
So you're saying an internal Jewish dialectic is playing out amongst the European peoples?
Excuse me.
That an internal, a dialectic internal to the Jews is playing out amongst European peoples, or rather amongst European societies in which they inhabit.
If you really, and so the Rebbe has been on a few kind of broadly NRX podcasts. I think at least one ascending or descending the tower on this this very website, socialmatter.com, or I guess .net.
.net.
Yes, .net. If you believe him, then the intellectual history of Europe, from, I don't know, 1700 onwards is competition between various Jewish heresies, which I'm not sure, I don't think that is credible. Without going too far into it, yes, you can draw this kind of elaborate social network that this guy was familiar with this thinker and he had these students. But honestly, when you're talking about truly intellectual Jews in 1700 to 1900 Europe, who survive and like had written works and whatever, you're talking about a pretty small social club, and a lot of them are going to know each other, and a lot of the same sorts of general just like trends in human ideology are going to pop up there. Like, you've had just as many Christian heresies that you could ascribe as the sort of origins of the same intellectual movements at various different times. But I mean, it is interesting, and you know, the show is intended to be a gloss over a lot of these ideas. So if you're interested in this, look up the Frankists and the Sabbateans as the sort of starting point.
Yeah, and to add some credence to that, I mean, it's sort of shaky history, and not a lot of it's well fleshed out. It's sort of pieced together, I think, from a lot of disparate sources. But there's the notion that everything from like the Renaissance onwards, or even further back than that, with like Charlemagne, like somewhat liberating Jews to conduct usury in the Frankish Empire at that time, going forward into like the merchants of Venice and other things like that. You go all the way to the Enlightenment or the pre-Enlightenment. You have people like Spinoza with this sort of Judeo-Dutch ethics system that became very popular in Europe, and you had things like Protestantism, which undoubtedly draws influence from Talmudic teaching. You can make a point that at the very least that there are competing Jewish systems that have impacted Europe and impacted the dialectic of Europe for at least 1,300 years now.
Yeah, I mean, like there's no question that there's been influence, but like influence is not the same thing as control. Like,
yeah,
there's a temptation in some circles to be like, oh look, there's a Jew, there's a Jew, there's a Jew, therefore the Jews control the whole thing. And like, there's just too many non-Jewish people, like with their own ideological leanings and their own intellectual cross-fertilization. Like, yes, like there's a lot of influence there, but like on the other hand, like you're not seeing the same sorts of things happen like within Jewish society. You're seeing a lot of the same things happen in societies that are extremely marginally affected by this whole process. So like, I mean, my suspicion is that there's something in kind of human ideological mimetic DNA that like leads to some of these trends, some of these aspects of the thing that we broadly describe as communism, that just sort of have like a eternal recurrence. And like, yeah, like there's going to be a lot of Jews around those kinds of things, and they might even be exhibiting some problematic behavior in a lot of cases. But I don't think that you can just attribute this to some particular aspect of that. I think that's just ahistorical. Or at least, like, you can't make sufficiently predictive predictions if that's your entire model of the world.
I'd like to cite some numbers on the Russian Revolution, if I may, but Nick, why don't you?
Well, go ahead. You start with that, because you're bringing us here into the 20th century, and I will respond to what Hank just said. You go right ahead, and I'll follow up.
Well, I think what Hank was referring to is maybe the origins of communism or kind of its broader scope over time. But in the case of actual, like, where did communism really take hold? I think the Jewish influence is pretty clear, and that was in Russia. And in 1917, I guess, when they took over, basically, there were approximately 300 out of 380 commissars who were Jewish, 284 of which came from the United States. These numbers are kind of hard to look away from. And if you can believe it or not, there were only something like 20 or maybe 40 Russians in that whole group in Russia. So this revolution was a Jewish revolution in my research.
I would agree totally in that specific case. Like, and even like kind of, you might even extrapolate it to other general cases, but like there's a really important thing that you lose out on. Like if you look at some German village, like Dan Carlin has a really fantastic series of podcasts about Unitarianism in the context of the 30 Years' War in Germany. Like there's no Prophets of Doom. There's no freaking Jews when you have a group of Unitarians that basically like form a miniature communist society, like in the ass end of Germany somewhere or in a prominent German town. Like these are not Jews saying that we're going to have like joint ownership of property and we're going to have free love and we're going to have like pacifism and be massacred and etc. So like, yes, basically shit ton of Jews, but like communism itself, like almost metaphysical communism, you see it popping up in a lot of non-Jewish contexts.
Well, this idea of metaphysical communism or a communism divorced from geopolitical realities, that is some kind of archetypical inclination amongst human societies. I mean, how would you define that as a category? What would you say are the signs of proto-communism in prior to the 20th century?
In Prophets of Doom, we don't have to do this segue too much, but in Prophets of Doom, first of all, I would recommend everyone listen to that as soon as possible. That's probably Dan Carlin's best podcast, right next to his Genghis Khan series.
Yeah, my favorite's the Khan, but yeah.
He makes the point that when Martin Luther was engaging in the Protestant Reformation, and just before Martin Luther, there were a litany of these sort of insane, very radical, anti-Catholic. They were essentially Catholic, but they were very anti-Catholic and anti-Vatican priests and intellectuals who were dead set on tearing apart European society. And the biggest reason for this metaphysical ethos of this proto-communism was a reaction to feudalism. And it was a reaction to the hierarchy of the state and of they weren't even really nation states at the time, of the empires at the time. People didn't want to live, or a lot of people didn't want to live in this feudal system anymore, varying reasons. And the hierarchy and the aristocracy, the Vatican, the kings knew, there's a geopolitical reality here. Like, we have to maintain these systems for things to function well in Europe. Unfortunately, a lot of people don't see it that way, and you can't make that case to the average person. You can't make that case to the average person today, and you couldn't make it to them in the 16th or 15th centuries.
However, the reaction to feudalism cannot be entirely lumped in under this category of communism, because there was non-communist socialism prior to the 20th century that had, prominent proponents such as like Oscar Wilde's.
Yeah, but I'm saying that like this early proto-communism that Hank is talking about in not really early Europe, but coming right out of the Middle Ages, was predominantly a reaction to feudal society and to the rigidity of feudalism at the time.
Right. I would agree with that. My personal take, having looked at communism over the years and having always been baffled by why it is that communism is sort of treated with kid gloves as amongst the 20th century, of course, Nazism, National Socialism is seen as the great evil of the 20th century, yet the body count doesn't compare and the conditions of life under these regimes don't compare. However, that being said, I would say that communism, the way that communism clarified itself to me was it was a specific strategy, because when you look into the actualities of communism in terms of when an actual communist state was created under Lenin in the 20th century, you have a lot of derivations from the orthodox Marxist line. I mean, the mere fact of the Russian Revolution was something of a refutation of the dialectical historical inevitability of the stages between feudalism and the glorious anarcho endpoint.
Yeah, like Jonathan Bowden has a great talk on the left and on partially on like the Russian Revolution, and I can't remember this individual's name, but the man who sort of introduced Lenin to communism was a Menshevik of some flavor, and him and others were actually against the idea of the Russian Revolution and were against the violence of it and just the act in general, if I remember correctly.
I believe that was the Menshevik point of view versus the Bolshevik.
But I'm trying to remember the specific individual's name, but he was the man who actually taught Lenin and gave Lenin a lot of his theoretical Marxist and knowledge on these subjects.
And this here is where I depart from a lot of people who want to look at this from a very ideological lens. I accept a lot of what Henk and Hans Jol are saying with respect to certain religious, social aspects of European society that were given to this type of thinking, given to rearranging society in a desirable way apart from the old order, etc. However, the reality of communism in the 20th century is really a struggle about power and geopolitics. It wasn't the extent to which I would lump people, supporters of communism, in a couple of loose categories, and you guys can let me know what you think. You have a handful of, true believing ideologues whose various support for the regime in Russia waned at various times. You also have very naive people who were duped by various propagandists that we will get into later. And you have who had a vendetta against many of their host societies, and communism served as a rationale and strategic mechanism for destroying these societies. And you had bankers, many of whom were also Jews, and liberals in the United States who were involved with the power structure in DC, who saw useful opportunities for their own ambitions to create basically a world stage, what you may hear Alex Jones talk about as the New World Order. And there's a couple ironies that come out of the 20th century, and one of which is the fact that Stalin, you may debate a left-winger, communist, whatever, Antifa, not advised, but you'll hear a common refrain. I'm sure you guys have heard it, I'm sure the listeners have heard it, which is that Russia was not communist, that Stalinism was not true communism.
Yeah, this is the standard tanky line.
Yeah, it comes back again.
State
and again.
capitalism, bro.
And I'm gonna be honest, I actually somewhat agree with this to a certain extent. The refrain is true: communism has never been tried, and I would not say that Stalinism is identical to communism. But the problem with trying to nail down what communism is this problem of the alliance between sort of the banking elite and various other disgruntled Jewish elite in these societies goes back to Marx. I mean, you had a great conflict between Marx and Mikhail Bakunin at one of the internationals, where Bakunin was basically like, "Look, this is controlled by bankers. It's controlled by big capital." And there was eventually, when communism became a force in the world, a geopolitical force in the world, there was an unmistakable alliance between capital, big money, and communism.
Remind me. Wasn't Engels of a certain almost moneyed nobility?
He was a textile
Yes.
millionaire, I believe.
That's where I was going next.
And this
exactly right.
So we can say that. Actually, and remind me, where is Engels from again?
I think he was
Engels
British,
was a
but
member of the Anglo elite.
England.
yeah.
So we can say that Moldbug is certainly right in an extent. So one of the famous axioms you'll see in NRX, and we'll get into this later, but is always America is a communist country. And for a litany of reasons, that's actually very much true. And you can actually see that this Anglo moneyed nobility sense of Protestant, I don't know, utilitarianism or whatever it was that motivated these people, actually baked itself into the Marxist cake from the get-go. this isn't organic. This isn't made from the real standpoint, theory, perspective of the underclass. This was the paranoid ravings of a degenerate loser, Marx, and a rich, bored Anglo-Saxon, Engels. It's actually kind of interesting.
There's why, like, champagne socialist is a stereotype, like, or limousine liberal, like, whatever is alliterative enough for you.
Let me respond to Hans' claims that you said that America is a communist country. Is that correct?
Yes, America is actually a communist country. It's sort of one of the iron laws.
I'm gonna have to. I disagree with that insofar as I would take the sort of Spenglerian analysis of civilization, and I would say that we are in a late stage civilization, and as such, we are ruled by money power.
Yeah, I think it's corporate fascism. I don't think it's communism. I think basically you have an oligarchic class.
But no. Wait, don't use the F word. Like, as we were talking about earlier, that end state of communism is inimical to the hardcore liberal individualist viewpoint. And that's because they're informed by a similar kind of materialistic value system. And communism, a lot of the competition, not just between communists and liberals, but between communists and fascists, was over who can deliver the goods materially.
Right.
Like that was always the struggle.
So the core kind of tenet of the Soviet regime's right to rule Russia was a promise of material prosperity.
Bingo.
What?
So
like,
I agree.
They had no like kind of universal justice claim that this was sort of like morally righteous or whatever.
Well, specific there, Hank. Who didn't have that claim and when?
Yeah. So I mean, this becomes a lot more the case post Stalin. Stalin makes this almost explicit, like Khrushchev and thereafter makes it extremely explicit, that the end path of their regime is to sort of have a rationalist allocation of resources that's going to allow them to bootstrap their economy, that's going to result in preserving their society through like military strength, but also a great material civilian abundance of consumer goods. And this is like fundamentally their claim, like socialism is the system that can produce this.
Well, in the case of Khrushchev, that was the famous showdown between Nixon and Khrushchev at the trade show where they had the American and Soviet produced kitchenware. Kind of a stupid example, but nonetheless, that was what was in the textbooks of everybody, showing what they're kind of fighting over. And it was a material competition. And I guess his "we will bury you," I think, was actually in reference to economic growth, not military.
It was a little bit of a mistranslation. A better one is "we will be present at your funeral." It wasn't in the, I guess, idiom as aggressive as that we would bury you alive or something.
Well,
so can I? So
yeah, please, Hans, go ahead.
Point earlier, I agree with you that in like the Spenglerian sense, and this is sort of late stage civilization, and that goes back to Nietzsche, obviously talking about the West being from the point of 1800 on being in a state of decline, sort of nihilistic decline, and things like this are sort of inevitable. The Moldbug point, really clarify it. Moldbug specifically uses the Big C communist, denotation.
That would be the party, not the ideology.
Right. He tries to make the point that it is a Big C communist country in a lot of ways for varying reasons, and it's hyperbolic, but it's supposed to get the point across to you that that it's not like the way the John Birch Society or your average boomer conservative pitches it, which is that like in the 60s, communists got into power at the universities and that's where everything got fucked up. Like it goes way beyond that, and that's sort of the Moldbug point.
Yeah, well, so I would agree with Moldbug in the sense that the communism runs deep, young Padawan. I mean, it runs deep in the sense that the people who ran Western society, who ran the liberal societies, they had no compunctions about communism, as we will see in a couple of interesting characters, both in the very high up people and in some of their operatives.
I'd like to bring one up. You mentioned the bankers before. So Jacob Schiff was head of...
Let's talk about Jacob Schiff, please.
He was head of Kuhn and Loeb, one of the largest investment banks in New York at the time. And he actually, going back all the way to the Russo-Japanese War in 1904 and 5, lent the Japanese, actually, what the hell's going on there, a bunch of money to fight the Russians. Now, what he was doing, in my interpretation, was basically fighting an ethnic war against the Romanov regime, which was ethnic Russian, in support of his compatriot ethnic cohort, the Jews. And he also then later on went to fund the Russian Revolution. He gave close to $24 million to them, which in today's terms is hundreds of millions. And he played a very instrumental role. And when you look at this, like he's this big capitalist in New York, and why is he funding communism? You have to think about the ethnic connection there. It's, you know, he's involved in these two real violent, processes going on in Russia that really have nothing to do with capitalism per se. But if you look at it from the ethnic lens, it makes a lot more sense.
Yes, it does, but it absolutely does. But there are a confluence of interests here. So in the 20th century, while we can describe it as liberalism, we can say neoliberalism, the Republic had more or less been killed. It had become an empire by the early 20th century, particularly prior to the early 20th.
Well, after
20th
the
century,
Civil War, you could argue it became an empire.
You could argue after Civil War, as well as the U.S. involvement in the Philippines, which I believe we discussed.
We did,
but in the early part,
that's when it leaped from our shores to the world for the first time.
And during the Wilson administration, as people might be aware, Wilson was shadowed, and you may even say handled, by a very peculiar individual named Edward Mandell House, and he had a very bizarre honorary title of colonel, which I've seen pop up actually relatively frequently.
Like Kentucky colonel?
Like fried chicken?
Yeah, exactly.
That was. I mean, you tell me, man. Like, what I will say is, there was a historian of the Mandell House was instrumental in the creation of the Council on Foreign Relations, which would and continues to serve as a coordinating mechanism for elite foreign policy consensus in America, and it's staffed by various politicians, bankers, and lawyers, as it was in the beginning and as it is now. And a historian of that, named Peter Gross, has some interesting things to say. And I'll also quote using a source from scholar Carrie Bolton, very interesting writer. This is Carrie Bolton. The first annual report of the CFR, November 1922, states that nearly 300 carefully chosen members had been recruited, including the international banker Herbert Lehman, who served as governor and senator of New York. He had previously alluded to, led the establishment attack on Senator McCarthy, W. Averell Harriman, and John Foster Dulles. Among founding members of the CFR mentioned by Gross were international bankers Paul Warburg, architect of the 1913 Federal Reserve Bank Act, Otto Kahn of Kuhn Loeb & Co., Kuhn Loeb senior partner Jacob Schiff, and bankroller of Russian Revolutionary Movement. And looking at Schiff's motivation, you have commentary by, this is Schiff writing to the New York Times. May I, through your columns, give expression to my joy that the Russian nation, a great and good people, have at last effected their deliverance from centuries of autocratic oppression, and through an almost bloodless revolution have now come into their own. Praise be God on high. And similarly, Schiff also wrote, replying to your request for my opinion of the effects of the revolution under Russian finances, I'm quite convinced that with the certainty of the development of the country's enormous resources, with which the shackles removed from a great people will follow present events, Russia will before long take rank financially amongst the most favored nations in the money markets of the world. So part of the CFR shilling here was the idea that like, we're not so worried about the Bolshevik Revolution getting out of hand. It'll become capitalist in no time. And we can ensure investment in the Soviet Union. And that's exactly what happened. Potent international financial interests work in favor of the immediate recognition of the Bolsheviks. Those influences has been largely responsible for the Anglo-American proposal in January to call Bolshevik representatives to Paris at the beginning of the peace conference, a proposal which failed after having been transformed into a suggestion for a conference with the Bolsheviks at Principo. The well-known American Jewish banker, Mr. Jacob Schiff, was known to be anxious to secure recognition for the Bolsheviks, and this was the early struggle in the.
And if you're an Anglo banker, this is actually like a pretty sweet idea, like in expectation, because I mean the history of the past, 200 years at that point, had been, in one lens, a sort of Russo-British struggle for domination of the continent. And now you have suddenly
that was like the original Crimean War, right?
Yeah, I mean the Crimean War, the Great Game in the Caucasus and India, Afghanistan, even in China, like the Japanese were effectively British, not necessarily allies, but very friendly during the Russo-Japanese War. There was kind of a general consensus in Europe that, yes, Russia has access to a shitload of resources. Time is, in some sense, on their side if they can liberate those resources, but they're held back by their very sclerotic regime and leadership and feudalism and all of these forces. And suddenly you have like a revolution that threatens to like overthrow this regime, massively destabilize the country. It's almost like what happened after the fall of the communist Russian regime in the 1990s, where you suddenly had every vulture from every dark corner of the globe think that, there's gold in them there hills. We have to get in there as soon as possible to ensure that we have our slice of this newly opened pie. We're going to make them into this ally of this kind of global Anglo commercial mercantile imperium, and we're going to get filthy, stinking rich in the process.
So, Moldbug.
I have a comment on that.
Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, it's an interesting analogy that the kind of capitalists are just seeing like disruption opportunity to basically get in and start lending and making money between the post-Soviet and the pre-Soviet, prior to the revolution period to get
Adam,
in.
Wait, hold that thought for a moment. In response to what you were saying earlier, here's Henry Wickham Steed commenting on what he believed to be Schiff's motivations. And this was, he said this to Colonel House. I insisted that, unknown to him, the prime movers were Jacob Schiff, Warburg, and other international financiers who wished above all to bolster up the Jewish Bolsheviks in order to secure a field for German and Jewish exploitation of Russia.
Ding, ding, ding. Like, it definitely helps, too, when it's like, your second or third cousins who are, in positions of leadership and influence within these quote-unquote moderate rebels. Like, that'll help you a great deal.
I think it goes beyond, though, just making money, because there were just some really atrocious...
it goes well beyond making money.
Really atrocious acts committed during the Russian Revolution and during the Soviet regime, especially in the early periods. I can give numbers, but what's up, Hans? Go ahead.
So, Moldbug talks about one individual named Thomas Wentworth Higginson. Not a very interesting or important figure. He was just sort of like a moneyed elite, Unitarian minister, abolitionist. He was one of the guys who supported John Brown and the abolitionist movement. And, he's your typical WASP. He's from Cambridge, Massachusetts, actually. And he was part of a group called the Society of Friends of Russian Freedom.
Yes.
Now, the Society of Friends of Russian Freedom was founded in 1890, and they kind of broadly disliked the Tsarism of Russia. They didn't want the Tsar in there. They didn't like the system he had established, and it was probably for this. The secret reason was for this reason. It was in order to maintain a steady supply of capital out of Russia into the Western world, as it were, by getting rid of the Tsar and getting rid of the aristocracy that was committed to Russian sovereignty. Now, what's interesting is that there was an English branch and that there was also an American branch of this organization, which was founded a year after the English branch was founded in 1890. So Thomas Wentworth Higginson was one of the founding members. Also, Mark Twain, John Greenleaf Whittier, James Russell Lowell, Julia Ward Howe, William Lloyd Garrison. These are all waspy figures who were of high social status and had a great deal of money, who were curiously interested in financing this publication called Free Russia from 1890 to 1914. So as soon as World War I really got underway, or was about to get underway for the Russians, this publication stopped all of a sudden. And for those who might be curious, the newsletter, this Free Russian newsletter, was distributed by Sergei Stepniak and Felix Volkovsky. Now, I'm not sure if either one of those are members of the Chosen People. Maybe our Eastern Slavic friends could give us some etymology on those surnames. But,
well, I can tell you that the
suspicious.
of Russian freedom were financed by Jacob Schiff.
Yes.
And there was a very interesting Red Cross mission to Russia, which is very peculiar. And this is these characters again. Here's Kerry Bolton talking about Colonel House's involvement. Colonel House attempted to sell Steed on the idea of some type of relationship with Bolshevik Russia in the guise of humanitarian aid for the Russian people, the type of activity that had been undertaken just after the Bolshevik Revolution, when the regime was precarious, under the guise of the American Red Cross mission. William Boyce Thompson, a director of the New York Federal Reserve Bank, organized the American Red Cross mission to Russia, funded mainly by Thompson and by International Harvester, that gave $200,000. The so-called Red Cross mission was largely comprised of business personnel and was, according to Thompson's assistant, Cornelius Kelleher, nothing but a mask for business interests. Of the 24 members of the American Red Cross mission, 5 were doctors, 2 were medical researchers, and the rest were lawyers and businessmen associated with Wall Street.
To top it off, by the way, while we're still on the subject of the Society of Friends of Russian Freedom, allegedly Alice Stone Blackwell, who was a well-known suffrage activist, was also part of this organization. And this is just the wiki entry on this organization, so I don't know how accurate this is, but allegedly the most active members were one Edmund Noble and one Lazar Goldenberg. So I'll let the readers or the listeners draw their own conclusions on the origins of this organization.
Well, and so herein you have this issue. You have these Anglo and Jewish bankers in the Northeast establishment who are bankrolling Russian Revolution and who are helping to provide cover. And we won't get into it too much here, but during the course of the Civil War, you had pretty blatant sabotage on behalf of the Red forces. There were these sort of superficial gestures of support for the White Army that were not really fully followed through with. A lot of problems there, and it's very easy looking at that history to come to the conclusion that the intention was, of course, the communist takeover of Russia, which happened. However, then you had Stalin come to power. Not too long after Lenin's demise, you had a new face of communism in the world, and this face was not very fluffy. It was not easy to sell people on the idea that Stalinism was the workers' utopia, because Stalinism was not the workers' utopia. Yet, looking at various Western intellectuals, there was a lot of apologia for it. There was a lot of, oh, well, this is Emma Goldman, I recall saying, a great red star rises in the east. And there were all these hopeful dupes, various Gentile dupes, who really believed this kind of stuff. But
on that point, we talked about Emma Goldman briefly in the last episode. She arguably was the main inspiration for Liana Cholgaj to go shoot President McKinley right in the gut.
Yes, he was a Polish anarchist, if I recall correctly, and I believe he was beaten to death on the spot by the Secret Service.
Oh, wonderful.
Interestingly enough,
there's an interesting sideline in like what the hell was going on to actually make, I guess, like Russian-Jewish relations, if you want to call them that, so taut at the time, and like why there was the sudden influx of these people into the U.S. Like there had been various partitions of Poland between various German states, notably Prussia, and the Russian Empire at the time. The last of which was in the late 1798 or something, that left the Tsar with a enormous number of Jews and Poles under his rule. There's an excellent book. It requires a little bit of scouting to find the decent translation, but you're all high agency, so you can do that. 200 Years Together by Alexander Solzhenitsyn.
The full translation is a bit difficult to find.
Yeah, there's a partial one on Countercurrents.
There's a WordPress blog that has almost the whole thing. There's a Countercurrents. Just be crafty and find it. But effectively, the Tsar was not happy with all of the... Like, this is the Fiddler on the Roof narrative, right? But, like, the Tsar was pissed off by having, like, all of these Jewish peasants that are, like, causing all these problems, aren't integrating with the rest of society, don't want to pay taxes,
it goes beyond that. There was a period when the Jews were not admitted into Russian high society. In other words, they weren't allowed into the government.
Of course.
Academia.
They're like an alien population.
Yeah, but
they
started to relax those controls, and what ended up happening was like Jews who were, I don't know, like at most 5% of the population ended up becoming like 50-75% of the faculty at universities, and so there was a backlash against that. And then this is what the Jews point to as anti-Semitism and the origins of their unfair treatment during the pogroms.
And more to the point, mechanically, like this backlash, the sort of pogroms and general anti-Jewish sentiment of the late 1800s leads directly to, if I'm looking at the correct set of numbers, 1.8 million Russian Jews emigrating to the United States.
To put that in context and just to show how significant that was, prior to that in the United States, there were two periods of immigration, some called the Sephardic immigration, which was no more than about 10,000 Jews in the United States, less than 1% of the total population.
Mostly to the south, no?
Right. And there was also a German wave, which was more gradual, and there were about 250,000 of them, but still it was less than 1% of the total population, as the United States was growing quite a bit at the time. However, after 1880, combined with the Polish Jews, the Russian and Polish group was over 3 million migrants, and a lot of them ended up in New York City, and that's why New York is basically, some call it Jew York. I mean, it really is a Jewish city.
Immediately after this, you start having a problem with anarcho-socialist terrorism. Wacky coincidence, but immediately after this wave, you have things like the assassination of William McKinley. You have things like the various, like the anarchist bombing of the
Haymarket,
New York Stock Exchange, the Haymarket, bombings,
we're going to
etc.
see Sacco and Vanzetti, though, in particular. And this is...
Right. And not all of these people are Jewish, but like, you know, Eastern Europe, overrepresented, etc., etc.
And by the way, really quickly, the coup de grace was Jewish Russian anarchist assassination of Tsar Alexander II.
Right.
Not only that, but apparently in some kind of ritualistic manner.
Yeah, they killed him in Red Square, and like in some, or what became Red Square in like some certain way. Like, there's some like weird occult stuff to the whole.
Dr. Raphael Johnson has material on that. I would encourage people to check out. He alleges that there was in fact a rabbi present for this. However, the key thing here is that as we all know, Jewish sentiment eventually shifts away from the USSR, and that's why we have our beloved American treasure, the neocons. And
actually, yeah, I have a quick talking point on that. The neocons, as some of you might or might not be aware, are actually Trotskyists or Trotskyites. Now, Leon Trotsky actually lived in New York City at one point. A lot of people are always surprised to hear that. Him and his whole family were living in I think it was Brooklyn, in a small apartment in sort of a working class area where he was called away to his path in life in Russia. And the core of this New York intellectuals movement, as it became known, the neocons, actually stems from what's the Socialist Workers Party. So the Socialist Workers Party is I think somewhat still around. They were originally a Trotskyist group that had like 100 guys who got expelled from the CPUSA in 1928, and they had several splinter organizations that formed in like the CLA and then American Workers Party.
So you're talking about the Socialist Labor Party or the Workers
Party?
I'm not sure. Okay, there's a little confusion there because I was gonna go on, please.
Well, so essentially, by the way, there's a lot of confusion because there's the Socialist Workers Party, the Socialist Labor Party, the Labor Party, the American Workers Party, the Communist Party of the USA. It was clusterfuck, and they were all purging each other for stupid bullshit constantly. And anyways, the basis of the neocons, as they were, as some people don't know, are actually from these early 20th century socialist and communist groups in New York City. People like what's his name, Irving Kristol.
Irving Kristol. The conflict between, ultimately, is one of the more bizarre facts of 20th century history, and it pains me to say this, but Stalin ends up coming out as sort of a pseudo, he's like kind of an anti-hero of the 20th century, because I understand people like to look at history and politics through very ideological lenses. I take a much more cynical approach to it. True believers, I think, are few and far between, and we'll get into how this was engineered. But the division was a division based in power, and Stalin really did hold all the cards in the Soviet Union. And so communism, the communist state of the 20th century, was whatever Stalin said it was. I mean, you had many revisions to various approaches. I mean, you had, so-called war communism, which was partly Lenin's concoction. But the key there was that the Stalinist Russia had to be managed and supported through the opinion of the Western world. And this was done through a series of networks and very peculiar characters, which, if you'd like, we can start getting into that. You see an overlap between espionage and ideology that really makes it difficult to look at things in terms, you can give the foundations of, why it is that certain Anglo-Americans would support communistic type thinking. You could trace this to various religious tendencies or social structure or late civilization, Spenglerian type perspective. But the specific opinions in the 20th century, particularly in the period of the 20s and 30s leading up to the Second World War, were conditioned in favor of Stalin's Russia. They were not these were not independent communist ideologues. These were people who had to conform to Stalin's order. And what was set up was something known as the Comintern, or Communist International. And this was the source of this was the organization that was supposed to present the happy face of utopian communism to the rest of the world. And the man in charge of that, Willy Mutzenberg, we can get into him in a second. I would like to add as well, in the 20s, there were a lot of agents that started getting placed in America, working directly for Stalinist regime. And among those, you had a very improbably and peculiarly named Armand Hammer. And Armand Hammer, if anyone has seen recent Guy Ritchie remake of Man from U.N.C.L.E., the actor in that, Armie Hammer, well, that's his grandfather. And Armand Hammer was in sort of the point man responsible. He owned a oil company, and he was the point man responsible for funneling funds to Russia from the United States under the guise of his firm was Occidental Petroleum, and he had the unique honor of having been one of the only people to be both personally acquainted with Lenin and with Ronald Reagan. And one of the funny parts about his life and career, he lived to a very old age. One of the very strange parts is that he was never prosecuted for his espionage activities. He was indicted briefly for some kind of campaign shenanigan finance stuff for Nixon, and that was the extent of his legal troubles for being a full-blown. These are, of course, Jewish communists. His name Armand Hammer comes from the Arm and Hammer symbol of the Socialist Labor Party, and he worked very tirelessly on behalf of the Stalinist regime, along with other key figures like Raymond Robbins and other agents of Stalinism that were placed in key aspects of the Roosevelt administration, many of which would come out subsequently in the revelations surrounding Alger Hiss by Whittaker Chambers, and also by Elizabeth Bentley.
I have a few names I'd like to read off real quick.
Yeah, please do.
And prior to the kind of focus period of our show, 20 to 1940, under the Sedition Act of 1918, U.S. Attorney General Mitchell Palmer actually deported thousands of foreign-born Communist Party members from the United States. So what ended up happening was many of them changed their names, and a lot of these party names were reorganized, changed to something else. So a lot of that confusion that Hans was referring to was partly intentional. And the Communist Party of America reemerged in 1921 using the legal front organization called the Workers' Party of America, and had an underground organization known as the CPUSA, Secret Apparatus. And some of these individuals who are embedded within the U.S. government include Solomon Adler and Harry Dexter White, nee Weiss. They were both Soviet agents in the U.S. Treasury Department. Israel Amter, he was in charge of civil rights, pro-Negro and pro-Jewish propaganda, and leader of the CPUSA in New York State. Other people include Michael Greenberg, Soviet agent in the White House, Adam Lapin, a Washington, D.C. and foreign correspondent for the Daily Worker, Abraham Lincoln Polonsky, a communist Hollywood film and radio script writer. And my sort of read on all this, it's kind of a broader analysis of how communists operate, and my observations just being around and seeing how these things are playing out today, is that the infiltration strategy that the communists seem to focus on revolves around kind of the four pillars of control in a society. And I'll call them the media, academia, labor, and government. And I'll add a fifth, finance. But that's not necessarily kind of an infiltration. You could just do that explicitly.
Finance. Well, I'll add a point. I would say the key many of the books written. There's a lot of very good books, and we'll cite some of them in our notes here. But the problem with a lot of these books is that they are written by liberals, and I mean that in the general liberal sense, not leftists per se. But they're written by liberals, and as such, they can't really confront the complicity of the Anglo upper classes, both in America and in England, towards the communist regime. It wasn't just like, I shouldn't even just say complicity. It was, in many ways, they were the engineers of it. They allowed it to happen for their own agendas, not just out of ideological sympathy. But please go on.
Just one final statement I'll make. So in a 1924 letter, Charles Ruthenberg, Executive Secretary of the Workers' Party of America, informs Israel Amter, the party's representative to the Comintern, that the party will be sending a delegation to Moscow to ask the Comintern to decide our labor policy. And this comes from a book called Soviet World. Basically, the sort of defenders of the kind of Communist Party of America would basically claim that the CPUSA was basically a kind of fellow traveler of the Soviets, and they weren't necessarily taking orders. They were basically just sort of fellow believers.
And that right there is the key. That is a lie. So the Communist Party...
That statement is supporting your assertion, and that they were actually taking
very deliberate lie.
And they took funding. In the same book lays out a lot of good documentary evidence to support this assertion that they were getting funding, and they were actually involved in money laundering for the communist operations throughout the world.
Because of who they targeted. So a big problem in confronting the so-called communist subversion is a couple ways to look at it. So when you say communist subversion of America, were there communist agents in America? Oh shit, man. I mean, again, you got Alger Hiss and Elizabeth Bentley's lists, which were corroborated by what's known as the Gorski memo, which was in Soviet intelligence documents, and it confirmed a lot of these people, from Chambers to Hiss, Noel Field, Harry White, the Silver Master Group. Some of the heaviest infiltration under the Roosevelt administration was in Treasury, Agriculture, and State Department, as well as the OSS, actually. And so, yes, there were a lot of these things.
Well, you mentioned Roosevelt. I think we should point out that prior to his inauguration in 1933, coincidentally, when Adolf Hitler was elected the same year, the United States didn't recognize the Soviet Union, and Roosevelt was the first president to do that.
Yes, and at the behest of many of his advisors, some of whom were legitimate Soviet agents, people like Harry Hopkins, who was subsequently responsible for drafting a lot of the American policies towards Germany in the post-war era. This is where you get the just disgusting appeasement of Stalinist Russia, such as things like Operation Keelhaul, the deportation of people claimed by the USSR back to the USSR, the very generous terms given at the Yalta Conference. Roosevelt was surrounded by people, Harry Dexter White as well, Lachlan Curry is another one. These people were varying degrees of full-blown Stalinist agents. I mean, really quite remarkable. And so McCarthy was quite right, and we're not going to get too far into McCarthy's jihad and who was responsible for his downfall, etc. But the bigger picture here is, yes, there were a lot of full-blown communist agents in America. However, there were also a lot of idiots, a lot of useful, useful idiots who were manipulated by the Comintern. And so the lie you mentioned earlier, it was a result of a very well concocted propaganda campaign that was designed to seduce the intellectual elite. And much of support for communism, if you look at things like the Cambridge Five, which we will get into full detail in a later episode, these people come from the upper crust of British society. And they viewed their support for the Stalinism or the USSR as sort of an extension of the value system. And this was played into with these various lies regarding the, humanistic quality. And this is where the anti-fascist movement was born as well, was through trying to put a nice face on the pig. And the point man in all of this was a man by the name of Willy Munzenberg. He was a very brilliant man. And he came from German working class background, which is very, very rare from German communists who were usually upper class and Jewish. He was sort of a man apart in that sense. And he became for a number of years, one of the most people in the world who's not really well known about. And I would point people to Steve Double Lives, which details Munzenberg's various projects. But to go through a couple of his big hits, you had in the early days during the famine in the Volga. Here, let me give you a summary from Stephen Cook over Munzenberg's life in general. His heyday lasted for a little less than 15 years, from the Volga famine in Russia and the Sacca and Vanzetti case in America to the Spanish Civil War. During that time, he was amazingly successful at mobilizing the intelligentsia of the West on behalf of a moralistic set of political attitudes responsive to Soviet meets read Stalinist. In the process, he organized and defined the enlightened moral agenda of his era. In a sense, Munzenberg's apparatus was instrumental as any other single fact in giving direction to the political attitudes we now call the 30s. Hundreds of groups and committees and publications operated under his auspices or those of his agents. The writers, artists, journalists, scientists, educators, clerics, columnists, filmmakers, and publishers, either under his influence or regularly manipulated by his, quote, Munzenberg men, present a startling list of notables from the era, from Ernest Hemingway to John Dos Passos to Lillian Hellman to George Gross to Erwin Piscator to Andre Malraux to Bertolt Brecht to Dorothy Parker to Kim Philby, Guy Burgess, and Anthony Blunt. Indeed, the entire cultural and intellectual apparatus of, quote, idealistic Stalinism outside Russia and much of its seeker apparatus operated within a system Munzenberg had guided into place.
So you mentioned Ernest Hemingway. There's a picture of him with Ilya Ehrenberg in Spain during the Spanish Civil War. And Ilya Ehrenberg was a writer in the Soviet Union who was notable,
viciously anti-Gentile,
viciously anti-German specifically. But
yes, exactly.
You're probably right. But like the documents demonstrate with quite
famous quote from one of his leaflets was like, "Kill the Germans, kill them all."
Yeah, it was actually an article called "Kill," but basically, let me see if I could find the quote. But just while I'm doing that, here it is. So he wrote, "We shall kill. If you have not killed at least one German a day, you have wasted that day. Do not count days, do not count miles, count only the number of Germans you have killed." So he was writing this. I'll give it, the devil's advocate. He was writing this during the German invasion of the Soviet Union, but he later had to defend that statement. I mean, even I think even Stalin thought that was extreme. But to your point earlier about how he was hanging out with kind of these Western literati, you could just go on the internet and find it. But there's a picture of him and Ernest Hemingway hanging out. So this whole connection, it's very interesting.
Well, one of the key groups in this was the London Bloomsbury group. They had such notables as Virginia Woolf, was a major member of that. Hemingway was sort of loosely involved. I mean, his scene was in Paris at the time, but him and Dos Passos were directly, the writer John Dos Passos, were directly involved with various Stalinist agents. And this was all part of, again, the Mutzenberg network. And his main lieutenant was a man by the name of Otto Katz, who was a very, very bizarre Jew, who met his end, ironically, being accused of Zionism and executed by the Czech communist state in the early 1950s. But what basically they would do, they set up, like Otto Katz he went to America and to Hollywood, and they set up things like the anti-Nazi, anti-fascist league in Hollywood. And someone mentioned earlier that talking about like Negroes and stuff. Well, Stalinists understood like how to tap into Western sentiments. They did not care about the American Negro, just like RT to this day does not give a shit about the American Negro, but they think that they're hurting the American empire by, highlighting things like Black Lives Matter. Very short-sighted and silly on their parts. But here is Stephen Koch talking about it. The apparatus had to seize on the most salient moral claims of the adversary culture from which almost all these people emerged and make it theirs. If Americans in the adversary culture understood that the oppression of blacks was the society's greatest institutionalized crime, Stalinism would take the highest of the high ground on the Negro question. And this was a general pattern. It was a very, and Stalin was skeptical. Mutzenberg ran the Communist International with Otto Katz, but Stalin was very skeptical of them, and Mutzenberg himself met his end in the early 1940s, hanging from a tree branch, probably killed by NKVD agents. Because Stalin ran a proper despotic tyrannical empire where he had rings within rings, and the only people admitted to those were people truly loyal to him. And Mutzenberg was responsible for all sorts of dialectical propaganda, very brilliant, such as gaining money and support for a aid program for the famine on the Volga, because this is somehow just an accident or something, humanitarian aid. And then he was also very instrumental in the popularization of the Sacco and Vanzetti case. People familiar, it's, these two Italian anarchists were accused of sort of a two-bit murder, and it became a cause celeb worldwide for the left. You had protests and stuff in European capitals, and it's always been a big issue. And the myths endure that they were somehow persecuted because they were trying to undermine the American myth of immigrants or American dream type thinking. They wanted to portray America as this hellish xenophobic.
Yet meanwhile, the crimes of the Soviet Union were being covered up by all these journalists. I mean,
people like Walter Duranty in particular.
Yeah. To this day, nobody even knows what the Holodomor is. I mean, you're talking about the famine on the Volga. I think that might be a separate one because I think that Dnieper is the river in Ukraine, but that's where close to 8 million people died during the Soviet regime. And this doesn't include all the millions of people that were killed in the Gulag or just the political assassinations. So I have a quote from Tel Aviv University's Dr. Yigal Halfin in reference to the cover-up, in his opinion, of what's going on at that time. Lenin, Stalin, and their successors could not have carried out their deeds without wide-scale cooperation of disciplined terror officials, cruel interrogators, snitches, executioners, guards, judges, perverts, and many bleeding hearts who were members of the progressive Western left and were deceived by the Soviet regime of horror and even provided it with a kosher certificate. And us Jews, an Israeli student finishes high school without ever hearing the name Genrikh Yagoda, the greatest Jewish murderer of the 20th century, the GPU's deputy commander and founder and commander of the NKVD, predecessor to the KGB. Yagoda diligently implemented Stalin's collectivization orders and is responsible for the deaths of at least 10 million people. His Jewish deputies established and managed the Gulag system.
Yeah, and right there on paper, Yagoda is one of the great foils to the joint liberal communist claim that Hitler was somehow the greatest mass murderer of the 20th century. when their own numbers that they claim of must 6 million are dwarfed by Yagoda alone, without getting into the other killings that took place in Russia. And so the propaganda aspect of this was indispensable, because what people knew, I mean, one of the biggest hacks was John Reed, who went over there and wrote his 10 Days That Shook the World. And people didn't really believe Reed, but they didn't really care because everyone knew he was a communist anyways. But Durante was given the Pulitzer for his work saying, yeah, people are starving, but it's, it's forced collectivization. It's just part of the program. And Durante himself...
Wasn't it stuff like it was just bad planning? Like, the strategy was carried out poorly.
Yeah, he failed to draw a distinction between a politically induced famine, deliberately really induced famine, and some kind of like happenstance of circumstance and nature that led people to starve to death in front of their families.
Yeah, well, he overqualifies it severely, and he ends up denying that the thing ever happened, and then finally admitting that it did, but the scale is overblown. And then the scale is
a New York Times writer. I don't think.
One of the fantastic things is that the New York Times makes their archives available. So just look at what Walter Durante wrote from the mid 20s. I think he was a first a war correspondent in the Russian Civil War, up until the mid 30s and the Moscow show trials in 38. You can just go and look at what he was writing and how he was writing about it, and it's absurd. He writes in August 1933, the height of the Holodomor, when in his own diary he's admitting that at least 10 million people have died already, that any report of a famine in Russia is today an exaggeration or malignant propaganda. The food shortage has affected the whole population in the last year, and particularly in the grain-producing provinces, the Ukraine and North Caucasus and Lower Volga, has, however, had a heavy loss of life. So it's an exaggeration, it's propaganda. I mean, sure, people are dying, but it's not that bad. Clearly there's an agenda here.
Well, this is one of the recurring things here, is who really believed this stuff? Who believed in the Soviet utopia, and why did they believe it? And
there were people who moved to the USSR, not particularly smart people, but you did have
Lee Harvey
people
Oswald.
as far, yeah.
Well, yeah,
and that's a special case
show
right there.
Yeah, but you had American socialists taking themselves and their whole families over to the USSR in the 20s and 30s.
Well, they were given privileged positions by Stalin. That was the kicker, is that when people did that, they would be given penthouses in Moscow. They're not going to go join the peasants, and so they could serve as propaganda mouthpieces, saying how great utopia is.
Yeah. They weren't going to work out at a factory in Chelyabinsk or going to work on a collectivized farm in the Ukraine. They were positioned in either Leningrad or Moscow and given given a penthouse, given a lot of amenities.
I think Oswald was given a Russian wife, even.
Nice.
They set him up with a job in a radio factory.
But I would affirm Oswald was working as a double agent, which is another that's a whole rabbit hole. But many of the people who were promoting this from Russia, from half of the Stalinist regime, Munzenberg and Katz, they were well aware of the realities of what was going on, and they were duping Western intellectuals and artists and filmmakers. Katz set him up in Hollywood, and set himself up in Hollywood. And the contrast between what people believed and the reality is very stark. And you had this humanistic face that was presented to people because it sold their liberalism. I mean, the Cambridge Five, who we'll get into more at a later point, but Burgess and Blunt and Kim Philby, and the Bloomsbury group in general, these people, many of them were homosexuals. They were faggots. In fact, let me read a quote from the Bloomsbury group. He was married to one of Virginia Woolf's early husbands, Strachley. He said about this, we can't be content with telling the truth, even though we must tell the whole truth, and the whole truth is the devil. It's madness for us to dream of making Dawagas understand the feelings are good. And we say in the same breath that the best ones are sodomitical. Our time will come in about 100 years hence. And sex, and this was, by the way, in a letter to John Maynard Keynes, talking about basically the Cambridge networks. And the thing I would emphasize here for people, like we're kind of given a overview that rambles about the place, because that's the thing. There's so many misconceptions and illusions. But one of the key places where this appealed to was in the upper class. It was in the intelligentsia and in the aristocratic circles of Anglo-American elites. I mean, these are the people who were sold on this stuff, and they were sold on it by playing to this anti-fascism. And this is where the anti-fascists were born. This is where it comes from. And because anti-fascists, remember, were in the 1930s, early 1930s, were not really directed against Hitler as they would like to think they were. And you'll see the Antifa today say like, oh, we should have been united, blah, blah, blah. Well, you dogs, you weren't united, and you weren't united because you were tools of the USSR. You've always been tools. You've been tools of somebody. You're either tools of Stalin, of communists, or you're tools of Western bankers. And the overlaps here come without end. I mean, there's no independent anti-fascist ideology, because what does any of this mean? What do they really oppose? What is an anti-fascist? Why was it so important to oppose fascism?
Well, I don't know what it was like back then, but if you talk to an anti-fascist today, they get lost if you actually challenge them in any of their points. They actually don't understand what they're saying. They're just kind of repeating things. I've encountered a few of these people.
Not any different from back then, though. That's my point. They had no conception of the reality, and all their talking points were guided through a series of networks that were run effectively by the NKVD and Stalin.
Yeah, I mean, you had the extremely embarrassing episode after the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact in 1939, when on a dime, the entire anti-fascist movement in the United States suddenly decided that, this Hitler guy, he's got his issues, he's not our guy, but he's all right. Like, we can just let him be.
Well, that's a very fascinating point.
Well, it's because of the pact between Hitler and Stalin.
What ended up happening, as I understand, was that they were anti-fascist prior to that agreement, and then when it happened, they towed the Stalin line, and that kind of revealed their loyalties. It was basically they were pro-Stalinist, maybe not so much anti-fascist. I mean, it was really about supporting the Soviet government.
And just like the anti-fascists today are pro-liberalism and globalism.
Oh, they don't like Russia now, though. So it's so interesting to see how
Let's get inside the mind. Like, if I'm going to shill for the system, then let's put ourselves in the mind of one of these kind of upper crust, like university educated socialist communists, whatever, and say 1936. Like the narrative that they are spinning at the time is that clearly capitalism has broken down. Like, this can't possibly be the path of the world going forward. You have this Great Depression. You've had this Great War 20 years prior that has effectively gutted Western civilization. You have at that moment immense material privation. At the same time, you have these rising nationalist movements that seem like they're on a collision course to a new world war. Clearly, they would say we need some sort of new ideology.
And I think those are all reasonable things to think. I'm not going to defend their conclusions, but I think those are reasonable questions
at the time,
and observations.
you look at some of the people that had this line. There were a large number of well-reasoned socialists. A lot of them were, tools of one party or another. But this is how they would describe themselves. That the Soviet Union is essentially an experiment in a new mode of being. And we have to let this experiment play out. We think it's going to be great. We think this is the wave of the future, but we just got to let these guys be and let them be sort of this, this shining city on a hill, one might say, to show us how communism can be implemented so that we can learn from them and do it in our own countries. This is the line that they were pushing. So, once you have the war kick off, these are the same people who are we have to prevent the Soviet Union from falling. Here's some vast amounts of lend-lease aid. Here's vast amounts of military secrets. Here's some
by the way,
schematics,
Stalinist agent Harry Hopkins was responsible for lend-lease, but please go on.
Right. But you'll see in the ones that wrote memoirs about why exactly it was they decided to betray their countries. And for the Soviet Union, a completely alien civilization about which they, in honesty, knew almost nothing. They would say oh, well, this is our last shot at peace because this is a new society. We have to give it the seed corn to let it fully fledge into a brave new socialist future. This ends up being a fucking disaster. But this is and it's really easy to sell people on this line, especially when it's something that's literally on the other side of the world. There is this sort of independent socialist tradition in the United States they can draw on.
If I can qualify that a little bit, I think it's a better sell in Europe in the 1920s when they're recovering from the First World War than it is in America. Now, however, in the 1930s, when you have the Great Depression, I think it's a global question of what do we do. But if you look back to actually what was happening in the first years of the Soviet Union, I believe it was Lenin who created the new economic plan or policy where it admitted that their communist economic policies were failing because people were starving. It was just bad. And so during the 1920s, I can kind of get it if you're in Europe and you're looking at the rubble of the First World War and you're well, this has got to change. I can get that. But America had no problem, after the war. It's actually incredibly booming time in the 1920s for the American population. The 1930s, I can see that.
The apparatchiks were not Stalin, for instance, never had any illusions about a communist revolution in America. The goal was to get the American state to do what he wanted. And after Yalta, he got what he wanted. And go ahead.
Just to Adam's point, in the late 1910s and early 1920s, as the war was winding down in the United States, and you had all these people coming back. There's a great Social Matter article that I'm going to plug here, Forgotten History, America's First Red Scare. And it makes the point that by 1919, unemployment was 12%. And you had a huge drop in the employment in Appalachia and New England, which were big population funnels at the time. And you also had a huge amount of new immigrants to the United States who had not assimilated very well up to that point, from Eastern Europe, from Italy, from Ireland, and of course a lot of Jews from Russia. And you had people like Arthur Adams, who formed the Communist Party, or the American Communist Party. He was a Soviet agent who took money directly from Moscow. You had Ludwig Martins, who was the founder of the Russian Soviet Government Bureau. And then he also came to the U.S. and worked to fund and build up these other Bolshevik and socialist institutions in the United States. And this is where you had the various anarchist bombings between 1914 and 1920. Anarchist bombings killed between 57 and 67 people. It's not totally clear. And like a lot of these were committed by, you could say, like immigrants. These were not, I don't know, like the upper crust intellectuals that Hank is talking about in the 30s. But there is sort of a backdrop to that where you had, I guess, like the first mover's advantage or disadvantage, where you had these sort of poor immigrants, mainly from Italy, actually, like Boston anarchists, who were basically trying to blow shit up wherever they could, and were just causing problems and were taking money from Bolsheviks to do it.
And the conflict between Bolshevism and anarchism really comes to a head in the Spanish Civil War, along with the various propaganda apparatus. And you had NKVD basically assassinating socialists that were not properly Stalinist. And this was what happened to George Orwell. Is he noticed this? If you read his book on his participation in the Spanish Civil War, Homage to Catalonia, he details this as basically the Spanish Civil War was a proxy war for these great ideological and geopolitical currents in the 20th century. You had fascists and liberals and Stalinists manipulating it in various ways. And it was if you're a true believing ideological socialist, it's really hard to continue to be a communist if you pay attention to what's going on in your supposed socialist or anarchist revolutions. You notice that there is no anarchist or socialist revolution that's allowed or endorsed by the various intellectual mouthpieces or financially by the USSR if it's not properly Stalinist.
Well, you asked in the beginning of the show, what does communism mean? And Hans gave his kind of very philosophical answer. To me, I've always looked at it kind of in a more practical sense and maybe more economic, analysis way of looking at things. But I always defined it as the state in which the government owns all property. And essentially, it's a command system where you're basically underneath the government in all aspects of your life, maybe except the bedroom or something. But even there, I'm sure they found ways. As opposed to socialism, which was supposed to be about people voluntarily somehow participating, and that was in Marx's, I think, far-seeing future of what communism was ultimately going to become, but it never did. It was always this like government-controlled apparatus that was very totalitarian, very Stalinist, and that was practically what ended up happening. So in my mind, that's what communism means. Maybe you could argue it doesn't really mean that in theory, but in practice, that's what it ended up looking like.
Yes. I mean, if you're the USSR, the so-called utopian workers' paradise was never for the workers. And there's really no, like, if you're an ideological socialist, it's very hard for me to understand, especially in the current year, why it is you would not be a national socialist. Why it is you would stick to this internationalist.
Because most 6 million.
Well, my useful idiots. I mean, that's a part of it, yeah. But like these people, again, you go back to Antifa or whatever. These people aren't even real socialists. They're just the dogs of neoliberalism.
No. They have no idea what they're doing. They're drug addicts. They want to have sex at the after party.
So I don't know. I mean, we've given an overview on. It is a very complicated issue because you have the intersection of a lot of the very important threads of 20th century history. You have espionage. You have capital, big money support for quote, communist, socialist revolutions, what have you. You have eventually this turns into the Cold War, and you have the pivot to the anti-Russian line. I mean, Uncle Joe is no longer our best friend. Russia is no longer a great ally. And a lot of it's hard to make sense of unless you really just follow the money. And I think you're right, Adam, that like communism is best look, if you're centralizing all the property and it's all owned by the state and all the stuff, well, this is very appealing to the foreign investors. It's a good excuse to plunder and destroy a nation. I mean, that's what it is.
Well, I think in the early phases of Lenin, maybe not so much Stalin, and especially after the war where things really became quite bleak for them, with perhaps the exception of Lend-Lease, which was through the government, frankly. I think the capitalist involvement in Russia was more clear during the Lenin years. There was the one case that I'm familiar with, at least, with the steel facility that ended up being called Hitler's grave during the World War II time at Magnitogorsk, and that was all built using American technical knowledge, and the engineers were flown over there to supervise.
The Magnetic Mountain.
Right,
Excellent book.
right. And there's, I think there's a dam also in Russia. I don't have the name of it, but it was basically, there's, you go on Wikipedia and you find pictures of it, but there's basically a set of turbines that they had to buy from America, and like the picture is basically like, these turbines were built in the Ohio factory of General Electric or something. There was a lot of like industrial capitalism going on over there, provided by America in the early years, and then obviously during the Cold War that all stopped. But before there was a lot of capitalist involvement.
Well, and therein lies the dirty secret of the 20th century, is that America wasn't so much beset by an ideological foe of communism, but the American people found themselves caught between an alliance of capitalists and communists. They were given no third way out.
And as we talked about earlier, communism has some deeper roots in America than I think the John Birch Society would let on, maybe out of fear of realizing that it runs so deep that it really is difficult to remove, or they just don't know. The one of the first people to bring the good news of communism to America was not Jewish, was not a foreigner. It was a man named Judge Thomas Hughes. And in 1870, Judge Thomas Hughes was a Christian socialist, and he took it upon himself to lecture and go around the country preaching the gospel of Karl Marx to anyone who would listen. And by 1872, the New York headquarters of the Marx International was removed. But by 1876, a Labor Party, the Working Men's Party of the United States, was formed. And once again, many of the people who were part of the Marx International in New York found themselves in the Working Man's Party in 1876.
What do you think was going on in the minds of people who were going to a congregation and they start hearing people talk about, as you so eloquently put it, the good word about communism? I mean, how does that square with somebody who believes in Christianity? Some would argue it squares very well because of the sort of universalist principles and the putting charity. Well, maybe that's not a communist principle, but in some ways it is about helping the impoverished, and that's kind of a Christian principle. How do you think that squared with those people at the time?
Well, that was exactly it. The propaganda apparatus, the Stalinist propaganda apparatus, fed right into these kinds of naivete sympathies. I mean, Munzenberg's network of intellectuals and artists and these kinds of people, they were called the innocents, and that was their role, was to be useful idiots for the party. And it was easy to sell on them because, as you see in people like Kim Philby, the arch traitor, they viewed it as an extension of what we would consider liberal principles. That's really, it was their value system led to, and prodded on by very clever communist propagandists, led to the idea that this was the final point. This is the good thing, and we were going to make sure everyone got it good and hard.
Well, as we discuss America, I think it's interesting to contrasted a little bit with what was happening in Russia in particular, but also China and other primarily peasant economies or societies, with America, where you did have a lot of people still on the farm, but I don't think they were serfs in the same sense. Essentially, they were owners of their own property, and I've always wondered about what the difference is between the American model and the Russian and Chinese model, for example, played out into the acceptance of communism. And obviously the acceptance in Russia and China was very different than the acceptance in America. And I've wondered if that has something to do with the fact that America was more of an individualist society where people have ownership in their own work.
That was the thing. Stalin himself had contempt for the Comintern, which was the Munzenberg's apparatus that was dedicated to this, things like the Popular Front. He had contempt for the fact, like, they had to do things like be softer on the homosexuals and all this. It would be seen by Stalin and co. as bourgeois excess, but it was considered to be useful as propaganda. And at the end, you have a complete divorce between the realities, again, of Soviet communism and the idiot illusions of Western intellectuals who would be useful mouthpieces for it. And that extends as well to China.
There's I don't really know if I guess it does conflict with a lot of Christianity, but a lot of American Protestants just didn't see it that way. Boldbug and the General Interact.
I don't think it conflicts that much. That's my point.
I mean, some of it does. Some of its endpoints conflict. So the endpoint of communism is, of course, no religion, and spirituality is right, sort of taboo.
Right.
That conflicts.
Sure.
So if you go with sort of the middle way, which is socialism, it doesn't conflict as much. Now, one of the reasons why the socialists all the various socialist parties and communist parties and working parties, whatever they were, all of them put together at their height, never got more than 2% of the electorate, I believe. Part of the reason for this was that the working class of America was deeply religious, more so at that point than the working class of a lot of European countries. And they simply were not interested. They were not interested once they learned that religion was supposed to be downplayed, or religion was supposed to be tenured with calls for economic practicality, just sort of real silliness that I think a lot of people couldn't contend with. But if you look at the history of socialism in America and of early communism in America, it all stems from Shakers and the Oneida community. The utopian socialism was essentially a product of a guy named Robert Owen, who was a Welsh industrialist who in 1825 he was religious, and he founded a communitarian colony in Indiana. And you had people who were deeply religious and transcendentalist like Nathaniel Hawthorne and Ralph Waldo Emerson, who lived on similar communities. This goes back decades before Marx was even put pen to paper, really.
Well, again, the sentiment appealed to what made sense. I mean, it was an easy sell when you sold it the right way, and that's what happened. And
so they always tried to go after the Catholic working class in America, and they were, a lot of them were just not interested because they were content with the church's teachings on labor, and they were content. This is pre-Vatican II. They were also very much content with their own community's ability to handle shortcomings from the economic system. The Mormons are actually a good example of this. The Mormons are essentially a modern day version of what the Catholic and some even the Protestant communities used to be much more like, which is internal communism, essentially, which is everyone pitches in, not voluntarily, but is forced to pitch in to help everyone else.
That's an interesting analogy.
And it's mostly peer pressure. I mean, forced meaning like you could be very much ostracized from your small little Mormon community if you don't help. And in the same sense, in early 20th century America, or even late 19th century America, these Catholic communities, if you didn't help out when people came to you for help, or when it was time to give some money at church, people noticed. And people made a point to let you know that they noticed. And now I think that's gone now. And so it became very tempting for a lot of these working class people who might still be somewhat religious, like we see out in the Midwest, who vote Democrat but are religiously conservative. But they don't have that community structure that they used to, that would prevent sort of this infiltration that's occurred.
It's the American mind and the individualistic liberal spirit and these religious strands that inform it. It was weak. It was weak to very shrewd, very cynical people from on high, both here in America and the Northeast establishment, and in the extension of the Stalinist apparatus. And these people were dupes. I mean, they were duped into it, and they sold it to the rest of the people. And there were some people who they understood communism as some kind of enemy of their faith, of their God, of their lives. And I think that that's a good way to explain why it is that now communism isn't seen so offensive, because you can find at a lot of Christian churches in America, you can find stuff that would have made Stalin blush.
Yeah. And one of Moldberg always points out, and a lot of anarchists always says, well, America today looks like the 1928 Communist Party platform. If you go look at all the things they want, progressive income tax, public control of schools, so on. The funny thing is that the socialist presidential candidate of 1928 was a man named Norman Thomas. Norman Thomas was a very upper crust WASP who was a Princeton graduate and a Presbyterian minister in upstate New York. And he's the man who succeeded Eugene's death and loss of the election. And it's almost comical that I don't know if anyone in NRX or Moldbug himself have pointed out this little coincidence, but that you have this man running on essentially upper crust WASP dictation down to the lower classes of what their lives should be, in the same year that they often cite as the year that America started to become a communist country, and is remarkably similar to the one today.
Well, I think communism has taken on a more clever form. I mean, I think people who sympathize with a lot of these ideals, as you pointed out, cannot ignore, obviously, the fact that the death toll of communist regimes of the 20th century were just too high to ignore. And I also heard an interesting observation about the European communist parties after the fall of the Soviet Union. They all changed their name to socialist because you just could not compare yourself to the Iron Curtain regimes prior to that. And I think also, I was sort of making the point earlier about the corporate involvement, and Nick's probably right. It's probably not an apt term to call it fascism, but it strikes me as like there's this strange alliance between the capitalist powers and the government apparatus that is basically, to use, I think it's Chomsky's term, manufacturing consent with the democratic polity. The demographic, like the democracy that we have and the people in it really don't have power. I mean, they think they do. And there's this illusion created by the media and the corporate sponsorship of it, and all of the different mechanisms and incentives set up by the employment situation for everybody who has to decide if they're, going to conform to the company or be out of work and conform to the government. There's really very little independence left in America, ironically, even though that was the sort of bedrock of the American rugged individualist philosophy. I think there's a statistic showing that there's, in contrast with the founding of the country where like 90% of the people were self-employed, essentially farmers, today it's probably closer to 2% where people are self-employed. And essentially you have to conform to either the corporate or the government system. And I think government makes up about 30% of the employment in the United States today. It's just unbelievable how systematized American society has become. So I don't know if there's a term, communist, capitalist, fascist, whatever you want to call it, but we're not free. And there's something weird going on between the government and the corporations where they basically promote the same ideologies. Every top corporation will say on their hiring application, we're an equal opportunity employer. We do not discriminate against this, and this. Why do they put that there? I mean, it was all these sort of government mandates and policies that were basically forcing them to do that. And they just realized, well, fine, we'll just do it. And then we'll also support open borders and free trade because that's more markets for us and cheaper labor. And so this kind of like world government, new world order thing is kind of revolving around these pillars of corporate and government power. And it's leaving behind the individual, even though they claim that, you're democratically involved. Give me a break. You live in a country the size of India, over 1 billion people, and you think you have power democratically over what goes on at the top. Give me a break. It's silly. It's getting worse.
There's three books that I think encapsulate what you're saying very well, and two of them lead to the other. The two precursors, I think, would be any of the works by Anthony C. Sutton, but most specifically, the best enemies money can buy, I believe is the complete title, and that is essentially a history of the Anglo-American attempts and the corporatist attempts to create out of sort of thin air groups like the Bolsheviks, and to an extent like the fascists in Italy and fascists in other places in Europe, and even had a stake in the early days of the Third Reich. The other book would be The Managerial Revolution, which we've mentioned before, as sort of a great way of understanding, which by the way was cited as an influence by Bolsheviks in Russia and by Communist Party officials, as a way of understanding
James Burnham himself was a former communist.
Yes, and how a great way of understanding how the workplace and how the administrative state of the government has changed. And these both lead to the work of Hayek, The Road to Serfdom. And sort of the end point of The Road to Serfdom is that the government and the corporations have all sort of merged into just a singular entity. And it's impossible to really understand the distinction at some point between them. But it doesn't matter. The point is that you've become a serf. You've lost any sense of freedom you might have had. You've lost any real fundamental liberty. And you're only presented with false liberties. You're only presented with false choices between systems that are just part of the same dialectic.
Well, and as I mentioned, to close on Orwell, there were a few people, Thomas Mann was one of them, even the Jewish writer Arthur Koestler. There were people who were smart enough and independent-minded enough to see the ruse that was going on, and they eventually snapped out of it. And Orwell, people throw Animal Farm around as a reference point, but I mean, the key thing in Animal Farm, the key final little moralistic lesson is the farmers and the pigs getting together. That's a great revelation. And that's the thing. I mean, you cast some of the ideologies aside, and at the end of the day, the 20th century is the story of the rise of a plutocracy, the New World Order. And ironically, that same communist country, Stalinist Russia, became an obstacle to this because it wasn't exactly some kind of true communism, as our pals on the Antifa left will point out. It was just simply a totalitarian system for the benefit of one man, really, and that was the final obstacle to the New World Order. And here today, we still have a little bit of Russian problem, but the ideologies are window dressing for the real struggle, and the real struggle is domination the fight between money power and, some of my reactionary friends would object to say money power versus the people. But ultimately that's what it is, because whether or not it's a government by the people, it's something that should effectively be run for the people. I mean, if the people are going to be treated like cattle, why should they give a damn if it's under communism or neoliberalism, capitalism, what have you? Who cares? You're still cattle to the system.
On to the next question. Go ahead.
Hi. Can you say why America is the greatest country in the world?
Why is America
not the greatest country in the world, Professor? That's my answer.
You're saying...
Yes. You, sorority girl, just in case you accidentally wander into a voting booth one day, there's some things you should know. And one of them is, there is absolutely no evidence to support the statement that we're the greatest country in the world. We're 7th in literacy, 27th in math, 22nd in science, 49th in life expectancy, 178th in infant mortality, 3rd in median household income, number 4 in labor force, and number 4 in exports. We lead the world in only 3 categories: number of incarcerated citizens per capita, number of adults who believe angels are real, and defense spending, where we spend more than the next 26 countries combined, 25 of whom are allies. Now, none of this is the fault of a 20-year-old college student, but you nonetheless are, without a doubt, a member of the worst generation ever. So when you ask what makes us the greatest country in the world, I don't know what the fuck you're talking about. Yosemite?
The whole agenda is to create a one world government, and the goals of the banking industry, not just the Federal Reserve System, but the private banks in Germany and England, all over Italy, all over the world, they all work together. They're all central banks, and they're all part of the Communist Manifesto. Central banking is one of the major planks of the Communist Manifesto. We talk about America being a capitalistic country, but yet at the same time we have a central bank that plans everything for us, right? And the graduated income tax is another plank of the Communist Manifesto, right? So right there you have 2 major planks of the Communist Manifesto that have been brought in because of the Federal Reserve System, okay? So the ultimate goal that these people have in mind is the goal to create a one world government. Now, they've taken over our government, but Republicans and Democrats, there's no difference anymore between the 2 parties. They control both parties. It doesn't matter to them which one wins, because who's ever running for president will be someone they anoint, okay? Whether it's Hillary Clinton or John McCain running for president next year, they're going to be people that are going to do what they want them to do. And the fact of the matter happens to be that you can't win an election unless you have enough money to win. They make sure who gets the money. It was necessary for them to take over America, take away our gun rights of freedom to bear arms, and create a country where we become slaves. Because once they take over America, the rest of the world becomes a lot easier for them.
November 16, 1933, the day we recognized the Soviet Union. Its purpose, its open stated goal, its strategy was to overthrow the rest of the world and impose the teachings of Marx, and then Leninism, and then we get to Stalin. Now, 4 American presidents, beginning in 1917, refused to recognize this revolutionary government, knowing full well that you could not have, quote, normal, or even normal without quotes, relations with a government calculating towards your own destruction. This was obviously, you could not have agreements, they would be broken, you could not have any kind of deals or alliances. And so this government was shunned by the United States until 1933. And that was the year in November when Franklin Roosevelt, then in his very first term, recognized the Soviet Union. In order to perpetuate this alliance, to continue relations with the Soviet Union, which became really an obsession of American governments from that day forward, the American government had to learn to lie to the people and tell us lies about communism, tell us lies about Stalin, tell us lies about the Soviet Union. And I think in some way, these ills that we see in our culture today, I think have their roots in this relationship that Roosevelt himself believed in, convergence. And I suppose that the money people you're talking about came out of that same mindset, and were promoting that same mindset, and were indeed the influence on Roosevelt in making this decision. Given the record of the Bolshevik government coming in terms of body count, in pre-revolutionary times, the Tsarist government executed about 17 political prisoners a year. Compare this to the Spanish Inquisition, which at its height destroyed 10 people a month. But in those early revolutionary years, the Soviet, the new Bolshevik secret police, executed without trial more than 1,000 people per month. Later in the 1930s, Stalin was killing tens of thousands of people per month. And yet the United States rushed into alliance, rushed to recognize the Soviet government under Roosevelt during World War II, rushed into this alliance. And so you go again to these advisors, many of whom we later learned, confirmed after archives opened on the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991, we later learned many of these senior officials in the United States government were working for Stalin. I don't feel the same way about that war anymore, and I'm convinced that if my father were still living, that he would also greatly question what he had actually participated in. Because when you look at that post-war map, what happened? There is a devastated Germany, and in that vacuum, there is a new, thriving, powerful, U.S.-supplied Soviet empire in its place. I think most Americans would tell you they're still living in a capitalist-free country with all manner of liberty. The brainwashing, the conditioning that has been so successful and has demoralized us is definitely bringing us to this point of a certain kind of tyranny. Does not have, at this point, does not have the gulag, it's not have people knocking at the door with guns yet. It does, however, make examples of truth tellers. It makes examples of people who cross the line, and this has served to tyrannize us. And we are experiencing this, and yet you ask most people, they'll say we won the Cold War. Well, I say, look, 100 million dead after the communist century, and Republicans who have the majority in Congress cannot muster the votes to repeal and defund socialized medicine. Who won the Cold War?
The communist rules for revolution read like this: corrupt the young, get them away from religion, get them interested in sex, make them superficial, and destroy their ruggedness. Always preach true democracy, but seize power as fast and as ruthlessly as possible. Communist rules for revolution: by encouraging government extravagance, destroy its credit, produce fear of inflation with rising prices and general discontent. Promote abortion, homosexuality, lesbianism, witchcraft, cause the restriction of all firearms on some pretext with a view of confiscating them and leaving the population helpless. That is communism. Let me tell you what communists do. You want to know when you've got a communist? This was the plan passed from Joseph Stalin to various communist district organizers in helping America self-destruct. Religion: discredit all Christian creeds. What have we got today? We've got occult cartoons, occult in the bookstores, and occult movies and occult videos. In the ethical area, corrupt morality by advocating promiscuity and degenerate perversion. During the early part of Bill Clinton's administration, under Jane Alexander, American taxpayers financed a 3-foot mound of synthetic excrement, a sculpture of 2 women engaging in oral sex, a film actually showing one man pushing his head into another man's rectum, a photo of a man with a bullwhip in his rectum, a film depicting Jesus Christ as a topless woman. Wake up! This is communism!
The very word secrecy is repugnant in a free and open society. And we are, as a people, inherently and historically opposed to secret societies, to secret oaths, and to secret proceedings. We decided long ago that the dangers of excessive and unwarranted concealment of pertinent facts far outweighed the dangers which are cited to justify it. Even today, there is little value in opposing the threat of a closed society by imitating its arbitrary restrictions. Even today, there is little value in ensuring the survival of our nation if our traditions do not survive with it. And there is very grave danger that an announced need for increased security will be seized upon by those anxious to expand its meaning to the very limits of official censorship and concealment. That I do not intend to permit to the extent that it's in my control. And no official of my administration, whether his rank is high or low, civilian or military, should interpret my words here tonight as an excuse to censor the news, to stifle dissent, to cover up our mistakes, or to withhold from the press and the public the facts they deserve to know. For we are opposed around the world by a monolithic and ruthless conspiracy that relies primarily on covert means for expanding its sphere of influence, on infiltration instead of invasion, on subversion instead of elections, on intimidation instead of free choice, on guerrillas by night instead of armies by day. It is a system which has conscripted vast human and material resources into the building of a tightly knit, highly efficient machine that combines military, diplomatic, intelligence, economic, scientific, and political operations. Its preparations are concealed, not published. Its mistakes are buried, not headlined. Its dissenters are silenced, not praised. Its dissenters are silenced, not praised. Its dissenters are silenced. Its dissenters are silenced. Its dissenters are silenced.